The Mega Man games are among the most popular on the NES. Well, 2 and 3 are anyway. But since opinions about the first one are still positive, and since it's so close to the other games, I'll include the original as well. Now, the thing about the Mega Man games is that they essentially have the same type of gameplay repeated across multiple games, so unless the design is different enough, it's only really worth purchasing one. The design in these 3 games, as far as I've noticed, is in the gray area as to whether they are different enough, so I'd only recommend playing 2 of these games. Which ones? Let's see. Well, to avoid sounding redundant, all of these games have very good control, especially when jumping, but there were some issues with the first 2 games that I'll address once I come to them. All the games let you choose the order in which you want to play the stages, which is pretty cool since it allows you to customize your path in the way that you see fit. Finding the right weapons for each boss can be kind of annoying because it's something you can only figure out through trial and error, so I'll just tell you the order I felt was most effective to save you some annoying parts. Every time you beat a boss's stage, you get his weapon, and in the latter 2 games, an extra power-up sometimes. As I previously mentioned, the controls are mostly great. You get a really good feel for what Mega Man can pull off in this game, and it makes learning precision platforming more fun. And the last similarity I noticed among these games is that all the games have a very distinct and colorful style to them, and all the enemies are pretty creative in how they look. Now the specifics. Mega Man 1 may not always be as well remembered as the other games, but many fans still consider it worth mentioning, and hey, everything starts somewhere. Why isn't it always remembered? It's mostly because it didn't sell particularly well in the United States. Most blame the laughably ugly box art, but who knows. Mega Man 1's most distinctive characteristic for those who've played it is that it's very, very hard. Unlike Ninja Gaiden though, the majority of the challenge seems by design, with precisely placed platforms and enemy patterns you have to learn to work with. It's also much easier to learn the patterns given by the enemies because the game is pretty forgiving in some stages and gives you ample room and time to figure out what you have to do. You'll still die a lot though, because there do exist bad design choices that are rather unfair, though most of them simply drain a small bit of your health, and the cause can be easily dispatched. Though you get to learn their pattern in a forgiving way, it can be tough to spot what exactly are the patterns on some enemies, because their pattern seems to largely depend on how you act, which isn't something you're always paying attention to. This is not bad design per se, but it's not user-friendly. There are certainly some moments that are going to piss you off royally though, such as the spring-loaded giant whose jumping pattern is tough to read, the glitchy platforms that can get you killed or leave you waiting, and just a lot of little things in this game that are rather unforgiving. These are problems that can cause you to feel especially frustrated because of the checkpoint distances in some regions, because having to replay a good portion of the stage because of memorization design is freaking annoying. There are 1 or 2 sections in some stages where the game is punishing the player for not having an item from a different stage. No, I'm not talking about a spare healing item or anything that would just simply help a little. I'm talking about the default challenges on each of the levels. I'd also like to mention that Mega Man 1's controls are a little slippery. Not too slippery, but it is noticeable and may get you killed. Despite all these problems, the game is very satisfying in little ways. Though the AI takes some time to figure out, there's a satisfaction in knowing that you can navigate a group of enemies without getting hit, and without really having memorized anything. Enemies are also nicely varied and very different in all the stages, which makes the stages all very unique, and adds a certain freshness to each stage that you enter. The Robot Masters are a very prominent part of the Mega Man games, and I gotta say, the bosses in this game are mostly cheap. The biggest problem I noted with the bosses was that their weapons were so overpowered. You could die very easily without really having figured out any patterns, and on a few bosses, they seem almost entirely random. This causes you to rely on the weapons a bit too much, but instead of creating a slightly easier adventure, it turns a good majority of the fights into anticlimactic tussles. Some of the bosses are kinda cool to fight with or without items, but mostly they're just annoying. To cut down on the annoyance, here's the best order: Bomb Man, Guts Man, Cut Man, Elect Man, or you had better not forget to take the Magnet Beam, which despite being easily missable, is not an optional weapon. Anyway, from Elect Man go to Iceman and abuse the hell out of the Magnet Beam, and from Iceman go to Fireman. Do not listen to Lord Cat. He knows nothing. In every one of the boss battles in these stages, use the previous boss's weapon against them, and you should be good. Remember, don't miss the magnet beam. One thing that really disappointed me about this game was its lack of utilization of the power-ups. Everything is just a strong hit or some other small benefit. There are some signs of interesting design that add depth to the game, but neither the level design nor the power-ups themselves are too deep once you get them. And that's what I really didn't like about this game. This game does have a certain extent of self-encouraged challenge, since changing your weapon does require you to go to a screen where you get a good look at everything, which did bring ideas to mind as to whether I could play this game without needing to rely on a certain weapon. Through persistent replays, I noticed that the big challenge of the game is what keeps replays fun, albeit annoying at times thanks to a lot of the bad design previously mentioned. The look of this game is kind of bland. Despite characters and enemies being very distinct, the backgrounds and the music are just not very memorable, and the score counter is entirely pointless. So this is definitely a game that requires a certain level of dedication to really enjoy, since some memorization will be required to get around the annoying sections that I've previously mentioned. Personally, Megaman will get a 7.5, and here's why. The lost potential and bad design choices really bugged me, but at its core, Megaman is a fun game with a long play life, though it took me quite a bit of time to really get into it. For general audiences, same score, but for different reasons. I doubt the lost potential will bug anyone, and for some reason I'm the only one who believes that the disappearing blocks gag is stupid, so I doubt a lot of the memorization will bug you. But this game is hard as hell, and pretty unforgiving in some stages, which are things that will turn people off from this game. Again, Mega Man 1 gets a 7.5 for general audiences, because it's still a fun Mega Man game when you get down to it, and for a hard NES game, I'd still recommend it more than Ninja Gaiden. But how about compared to other Mega Man games? Well, let's look at Mega Man 2 now. Immediately, the first thing I noticed about this game was that from an auditory and visual sense, this game is a large improvement from the first game. Gone are the bland backgrounds and mostly forgettable music from the first game. This game decided to up the ante when it came to presentation. The environments look great. They're nicely detailed, very distinct in each stage, and seem a lot more vibrant and colorful. There should be something said about the bosses in this game, who exude a greater level of character and personality than the bosses in Mega Man 1. And of course, what can be said about the music that dozens of covers and remixes online haven't already said? It's fucking awesome. This game has the same overall structure as Mega Man 1, but does a few things differently. The controls are a tad bit less slippery, but still feel a little loose. Again, not much of an issue, but it can create problems. As I've said before, the stages are very distinct in how they look, but they're also distinct in how they play, since each stage has its own gimmick. Personally though, I thought they lost their novelty pretty quickly. This game does more to encourage repeated playthrough than its predecessor, since the rewards for taking a certain order are no longer health, but E-Tanks, which are still technically health, but in a different way. E-Tanks started in this game and act as reserve health packs, which is handy for when you're being overwhelmed and also serves as another challenge you may thrust upon yourself. This adds another element of strategy and replayability, since there are a few cases where getting most E-Tanks requires you to take a path that you may want to avoid because you won't be able to use a certain item on what may be a tough stage. This also drops the difficulty considerably, since you don't always have to worry about health. And that drop in difficulty is actually my biggest problem with this game. Design is less bullshit about the challenge, but at the same time, it seems that the bullshit is the only challenge in this game. Most of the tough parts in this game are those stupid memorization sections, or enemies that get a lot of cheap hits. Everything else is pretty damn easy. Oddly enough, the levels are so easy that it took me a while to realize that they're well paced if you assume that certain sections are supposed to be challenging. The stages emphasize fighting easy enemies more than tough platforming, so most of the fair challenge is figuring out enemy patterns, which is pretty easy here. I also think it's worth mentioning that I found a few problems with respawning enemies, but only in a few sections. The bosses are kind of hard to describe in this game. When it comes to the robot masters, I'll usually die when I initially fight them, mainly because of the damage I took in the stage, but when I go to fight them again with full health, I'll barely have any idea of how to fight them, and yet I'll somehow still win. This is the case for a large quantity of the Robot Masters, and this makes the stages end in a way that just feels unsatisfactory. The other Robot Masters and most of the bosses in the final section are just cheap bastards, which like last time, forces you to rely on your special weapons more than you should. The only bosses I thought were a good challenge were Heatman and Metalman, and even they are a little cheap. What's weird though is that most of the easy bosses can be taken on with a buster, and I barely had a problem with them, though it was a little harder. The weapons that the Robot Masters give you are a little more versatile, but again, they are mostly combat, which actually makes most of them more useless because of how powerful a single one of them is. The metal blades are so absurdly overpowered in their range, ammo size, flexibility, projectile size, and strength that using any other weapon seems unnecessary. The only thing that balances the metal blades out is that they don't always work on certain enemies, but they are a minority among all of your opponents. Since the blades are such a great weapon, it's probably no surprise that most people start the game facing Metalman, and my order is barely any different. I suggest you either start with Airman or Metalman first, and beat them with a buster. Metalman's blades make Airman stage a little easier, but beating Airman stage first will let you grab an E-Tank without needing to kill yourself, thanks to the item number 2. Use the metal blades to mow down Woodman and Bubbleman, use the Air Blaster against Crashman, then beat Flashman using the metal blades, making sure to use the crash bombs to clear the path in his stage. Use the Flash Stopper on Quickman until it runs out, then use the Buster because the crash bombs are annoying to use. Finally, go to Heatman stage, use the item number 2 to pass that annoying disappearing block section, and use Bubbleman's weapon against Heatman. If you're still having difficulty, first of all, you should slap yourself for being such an enormous pussy, but you can also start over on the easy setting, which is called normal for some odd reason. Like last time, there are some sections that expect you to know what weapon to use ahead of time, but it's not too big of an issue because it only seems to happen during boss battles. The easy difficulty is probably the reason for this, but this game has a very good sense of progress compared to Mega Man 1. You almost always feel like you're moving ahead and advancing. The speed bumps to this come as those stupid memorization sections and some very strict boss battles in Wily's castle, but they're few and far in between, and the bigger problem is that the sections before them are kind of boring. I think the bosses in this game really exemplify how I feel about Mega Man 2. It's just unsatisfying. All the challenge comes from memorization, cheap hits, and a few button mashing scenes, and that's really it. The bosses are just not very good, any real satisfactory challenge is absent, and it just feels like there's something missing to this game. Personally, I'll give Mega Man 2 a 7.5 for not hitting a lot of the low points of Mega Man 1, but also for not hitting a lot of its high points. There's a great sense of flow, variety, and progress to this game, but it just lacks any real sense of accomplishment for me. Now, to fully exhibit how pretentious I am, I'm going to make a complete turnaround on my own opinion to tell you why I'd recommend this game to you. I have a very odd sense of accomplishment that not everyone else shared. Many of the memorization challenges seem to be loved by many, even though I think they're completely stupid. Like Mega Man 1, most of you guys will probably not even think about the lost potential of the power-ups, and my playstyle seems to be significantly different from most people. I tend to take the most logical and safe approach right from the start, and I noticed most other people only choose to do this once they've died several dozen times, so you may find more challenge in beating this game than I did. This game is also very flashy. Literally. This game flashes for various reasons, mostly beating a boss or a mini-boss, and while this personally just gave me a headache, the visual stimulation could heighten your experience with the game. With the E-Tanks, the more forgiving design, and the difficulty made for people without thumbs, this game is much more user-friendly than Mega Man 1, and that helps ease most people into playing the game. This game also has the most memorable look out of the 3 games here, and it has just a lot of memorable moments. Again, this is just me forcing my bloated conceitedness down your throat by telling you what other people will have in their mind, but I do think that most people will play Mega Man 2 and see a game with great controls, well-paced levels, a tough challenge, a good length, memorable graphics, moments, and music, all in a game that has a great sense of progress and flow. So for general audiences, that is my perception of audiences in general, Mega Man 2 is perfect. Go Team Retard. Mega Man 3 is always a mixed topic when related to Mega Man 2, since most hardcore Mega Man fans tend to be torn as to which of these two games is their favorite. The big changes that most people bring up in this game for Mega Man 2 are Rush, Proto Man, and the Slide. Rush basically replaces the numbered items for Mega Man 2 and really isn't as big of a difference as people like to say, though he does add some personality to the game. Proto Man is also an addition, but mostly for story, which is mainly non-existent anyway, so he really doesn't have much of a point. Finally, you get the Slide, which is a cool new ability that is utilized to a certain degree, but I felt they could have done more. One more thing I noticed is that any slippery control from before has since disappeared, and the sense of control here is better than either of the two games. Which is a big plus because the 8 Robot Masters here require a much greater sense of skill than before, and are a hell of a lot more fun because of it. Fighting these 8 Robot Masters tests you on being able to quickly recognize their pattern and early signs of their next move. This is usually very visible. The boss's patterns are simple enough to figure out, but still require a lot of skill to truly master, which is what many people love about older games more than anything. While one or two bosses like Needleman are kind of cheap, these are the most well-balanced Robot Masters out of the original 3 games. They do a few things to try to randomize their pattern while still keeping the easily recognizable first actions, and I thought this worked well. It's just that the reaction time needed to see a few of these can be pretty ridiculous, but still, not as bad as the previous 2 games. Something I also really like from these boss battles is that you don't have to rely on the weapons anywhere near as much as you had to in the other games. You can almost always beat these guys with just the Buster, and let me tell ya, it's satisfying as all hell. Though this might be the reason for me liking these bosses more than the ones from Mega Man 2, it may be trouble for other people that the bosses here are much harder. The same can be said for the stages, as they are much tougher than the ones in Mega Man 2, both for good and bad reasons. The stages for the 8 Robot Masters are tougher in a good way, because they do a lot more this time around. There are more types of enemies, and they do a lot more interesting things with the platforming and enemy placements. These stages are also tougher because they are a little cheaper. Not that much more, but it will get on your bad side. Despite the Slide and Rush opening up some more opportunity for inspired level design, they really didn't do much with these concepts. Instead, they decided to double the amount of gimmicks in each stage, which actually works really well and helps these stages' appeal last much longer than the ones in Mega Man 2. Unfortunately, this game chose once again to make all the weapons nothing but combat instruments, and does very little to utilize them in each stage. Actually, I would even go so far as to say this game is the worst offender of this lost potential, and I personally blame Rush. They put any and all unique shortcut or alternate path design on him, which really got on my nerve. The levels also feel a little padded, which is probably meant to help with the pacing, but I just felt it cut down the flow a bit too much. Interestingly enough, this game hides a lot more E-tanks from you this time around, but they are much easier to get now that you're guaranteed to have at least Rush Claw from the beginning, so they're basically free giveaways. Believe it or not, I think this was a good decision, because these tanks help against the few cheap Robot Masters and help ease newer players into the game, which is a plus for a lot of people. I think what might be a bigger help, though, is knowing the order to fight the Robot Masters in. But that's going to be kind of tough to talk about, because the Robot Masters have 2 separate orders of weakness. Starting out, I would first face Top Man, Shadow Man, Spark Man, Magnet Man, then Hard Man. In the second cycle of weakness, Snake Man beats Gemini Man, who beats Needle Man, who in return beats Snake Man. If I was to start anywhere on this cycle, it'd be Snake Man. Mostly everything so far has been very positive, but that's because I've only talked about the first half of this game, which also brings me to the point that this game is much longer than either of the 2 games before it. For some, this may mean that they are getting their money's worth, but since they seem to run out of ideas about halfway through it, it just feels like more padding, and this is also where more of the game's problems come to sight. The one I began to notice more and more as I kept playing was that this game is a little buggy. During the second half, there are many areas where your controls become unresponsive, and while they existed in the first half, mostly during boss battles, they really become commonplace in the second half. This is where I actually don't mind them forcing you to use a certain item here, because either way you're guaranteed to have everything by the time you've come to this region. There's one big problem though. The only power-ups you utilize are Rush Marine and Rush Jet, and the levels used to test your skills with these two weapons have the most annoying level design in the entire game. Other than that, the 4 levels you unlock use old levels as templates, and therefore recycle the levels way too much, and really pad out these levels unnecessarily. The second half is also where each stage has 2 robot bosses, all of whom are a single robot imitating a robot from Mega Man 2, which brings 4 things to mind. 1. Mega Man 2's bosses don't hold a candle to Mega Man 3's. 2. Mega Man 3's weapons were clearly not designed with these bosses in mind. Although all the power-ups you gain from the Robot Masters are weapons, they're incredibly useless here, as they mostly are in the entire game, because either they're too weak or too impractical. Third thing that came to mind when I started fighting these mini-bosses: this robot is too fucking big. It gets annoying trying to dodge a robot who can move as fast as Quickman, but has a lot more mass to try to dodge. 4. This game is buggy. I've already mentioned this, but this is actually the big proof that Mega Man 3 had coding issues, because even robots and the attacks from Mega Man 2 are heavily slowed down, and this will cause many control issues, especially considering how it can also make your buttons completely unresponsive. Even with the slide, these bosses are much harder this time around because they just weren't well polished. They didn't fix any of the problems with the bosses from the old games, and they didn't adapt anything to work with Mega Man's new arsenal. Dr. Wily's castle also suffers because of the new added stages, because every concept in the castle is from previous stages, which have already been milked to death by the 4 updated stages, which just makes Dr. Wily's castle feel like an afterthought and more padding. I may be very specific in these criticisms, but I wouldn't consider this nitpicking. Mega Man 2 fanboys usually nitpick things like the odd choice of enemy design, the odd choice of backgrounds, and most petty of all, the lack of an intro. To be fair, complaints I've heard from that crowd that are more arguable are that the music in this game is not as good as the music in the second one, this game seems significantly slower, and that this was about the point where the bosses were getting stupid, with guys like Hardman and Snakeman, and even these are pretty petty complaints. Now, as much as I've crapped on the second half, it's by no means horrible. It takes some time for the padding to become very much noticeable, and excluding some of the sections I've already mentioned, a lot of stages are still well designed, albeit without any real innovation. That really is an issue though, because without any innovation, the levels start to lose their spark, and it just makes the game end on such a low note. So yeah, this game has a lot of low points, but don't take anything away from the first half. It's very solid, fun, and has more high moments than either 1 or 2. Unfortunately, its low points drag it down pretty badly, and although none of them hit the strength of some of the lows in Mega Man 1, there are much more of them. Personally, Mega Man 3 will get a 7.5 from me because ultimately, this game is on par with the other 2 games. It may seem weird that I don't pick a favorite amongst this group, but all these games really did disappoint me in about the same way, and just turned out to be only good and not the incredible classics of yesteryear. Do I think most people will still like Mega Man 3? Yes! The padding isn't blatant, and I've noticed that most of my problems with the second half can be related to my super conservative playing style, which is pretty different from how most people play. I also have much less patience for monotony than most people, and so I get easily bored if something doesn't change fast enough, and this game is still well paced enough to keep most people's attention. The second half will still give most players issues though, since it is more challenging, and the glitches and slowdowns are things that are very hard to miss. This is roughly my estimation, but for general audiences, Mega Man 3 gets an 8.5. While I hold my ground that no single game is better than the other in this trilogy, I can't deny that 2 and 3 are simply more user-friendly and have issues that no one but me cares about. If you haven't played these games yet, I'd just buy 2 and 3, since 1 is only good if you are looking for a great challenge, which most people don't seem to want. Thanks for watching, and have fun.